Welcome all. It is noon here in Chicago, and so we are going to get started with our conversation at Graham on theories of life, featuring Isabel Gabel. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I am the dean here at the Graham School at the gorgeous University of Chicago. Welcome virtually to our campus today. For those who are not familiar with the Graham School, we are a founding division of the University of Chicago, because when William Rainey Harper and John D. Rockefeller, pictured at the front, were imagining the future of this university, they wanted to revolutionize university study and ensure that the big ideas that were being developed here and the transformative education being delivered here would not just be for our students, but would be for the wider world. And so Harper had a vision to bring the ideas to people across every age and stage of their life. And so the Graham School, the first extension of a university in the United States for the purpose of continuing lifelong liberal arts, was born. We remain with that mission today. And so 132 years later, we are still trailblazing new approaches to lifelong learning. And indeed, this collaboration that will be explored today with the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge reflects that commitment to using multidisciplinary knowledge and to bringing that to learners all around the world. We continue to believe that the best way to approach our work is to rigorously explore big ideas that change and challenge the world. And today we'll be going deep into one aspect of our work, which is our open enrollment programs, where you can see across all divisions of the university. We also have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world, a basic program where you can go deep into the great texts of the Western tradition, and an annual program series where you can better understand Chicago and look into the future of museum publishing. I'll just acknowledge that it is holiday time, and we are incredibly grateful to all of you for being part of our universe. We are especially grateful to the many people who are in our Graham Circle that allows us to expand our reach and bring in learners from all different parts of our world. We are also very grateful to those of you who have already contributed to our book drive, which is allowing us to expand literacy here in Chicago schools and beyond. And finally, we want to welcome you to our holiday reception and broadening access event, which will be in person at the Gleacher Center later this month, and I'll put in the chat more on that gathering. But you are all here today for a very specific reason, which is you want to hear from Isabel Gabel, a historian of science, medicine, and political thought. Her work explores how the modern life sciences created spaces of uncertainty and irresolvability, which in turn reshaped the epistemological foundations of liberalism in the 20th century. At IFK, she is working on a history of complexity, tentatively entitled At the Edges of Chaos, Complexity Theory Between Science and Governance. Her work brings together histories of molecular biology, cybernetics, and big data, and she is going to be teaching at Graham this winter a course on theories of life. And so, Isabel, I want to start there. And I know your research, as we've just talked about, is at this intersection of science, medicine, and political thought. And so you are looking at that in your course. Tell us, though, a little bit about your research and how you came to this specific interest in teaching on how theories of life have changed as the life sciences have reshaped how we understand life itself.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. First, I'm just really excited to be here and to be teaching in the Graham School. And also, I realized that one of the things I haven't said about this course to you is that it's actually also some of my absolute favorite philosophy texts, full stop, that I have constructed into a course that relates to my research as well. But just in terms of more of my research, you summed it up really well. Essentially, I'm interested in two major ways that the sciences can affect culture and political thought and philosophy. And one is, I think, a bit more familiar. So it's sort of like, how is it that major discoveries, for example, like the big discoveries around evolution that happened in the 20th century, most famously the discovery of the structure of DNA, but there were like a lot of kind of related discoveries that brought a sort of theoretical Darwinism into contact with experimental data. So how do these major watershed moments in the sciences transform other realms of human knowledge and human politics and ethics? So that's one element I explore. And the other, which I think is parallel, is how do kind of the places that's like scientific uncertainty, unknowns in the sciences, the ways that scientists think about what they don't know, the ways that they confront what they don't know, how do those kind of spaces of the unknown in the sciences become also politically meaningful and culturally meaningful? And so I have, I can talk about, excuse me, examples of both of those sides. And again, I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea that evolution, like the theory of evolution becoming sort of more modern, transforms how much we know about human and Earth history, gives a kind of deeper understanding of like, just in terms of how many years back we can even account for pieces of history. And then at the same time, there are cases both prior to that moment and even in the contemporary moment where what scientists can't quite figure out or what they're honing in on as an unknown becomes very interesting to people outside the sciences. So I can go into an example of that, or we can, should I do that now?
Yeah, sure. Go into the example and then we'll kind of lay out the course in broad.
I think my favorite example, there's a couple, but one of my favorite examples is from before, like in the 1930s and 40s in France, which is what my first book was about or is about. There was a sort of crisis of evolutionary knowledge, and scientists in France in particular were not able to match their experimental data on animals with their theory of evolution. And that was because French biologists kind of believed in this neo-Lamarckian model. So they believed, which some of us have probably learned about this in high school, that has this disproven idea that animals don't evolve through natural selection, but rather evolve through adapting to their environments, and then they pass those changes down. And that's attributed to this French naturalist Lamarck. And so my favorite example, I think, of the unknown becoming important is that French biologists were trying to prove this theory for generations. And when they sort of couldn't experimentally demonstrate it, which we now understand is because Darwin was more right than Lamarck, although it's complicated, that led them to a kind of argument that experiments weren't actually the best way to understand natural history. And they started arguing that experimentation was not actually the most scientifically relevant method for learning about the evolutionary past. And then that became really interesting to theories of history and philosophers of history in France in that period. And so one of the things I've tracked is how this argument against experimentation by scientists turns into an argument against, or an argument in favor of new ways of conceiving of history in the 20th century.
Well, so that is a fascinating example. And I think it speaks to a kind of broader theme of the course, which is, we have these different theories, right? And what happens when they come into tension with one another? And in this case, tension across disciplines, right? Because you have philosophy and the way we look at life, and then you have science, which is a different methodology. And then they are able to prove, in a certain sense, a certain basis. And then how does that get reflected in this more artistic, potentially, you could say, approach within philosophy of why are we here and what is our meaning? And I'll just share that I have a personal interest and eagerness to learn from your course, because I grew up with a mom who was a scientist and middle school science teacher, but who also was a person of faith and who would always be trying to reconcile between, being a believer in evolution, but also coming back and saying, well, these 7 days of creation, maybe they're a metaphor for what's happening evolutionary. And I was always asking her questions about it. And so always was fascinated in her own house at how you'd see, scientific developments, and then, a question of how do you bring this into theories of life. But let's focus back on your course. Apologies for my tangent. You lay out this kind of really exciting syllabus, and in it, you go kind of across the 20th century and then, come toward today. Can you just give a snapshot, and then we'll dive into different moments but a snapshot of what's happening during this time period where, let's say starting around the time of Foucault and, this moment where we're starting to reckon with how theories of life are engaging with the life sciences all the way to, discovery of DNA and what you see as some of the key inflection points. And again, just the snapshot now, and then we'll dive into moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the course is really divided in two because we make in only 8 weeks, DNA is kind of the hinge point. So really the arc is about how prior to the discovery of the structure of DNA, and that comes along with a big paradigm shift in the life sciences that's not caused by this, but the whole molecularization of biology and the new technologies and new discoveries that allow for this molecular model to proceed in the life sciences. So we start prior to that, when a lot of debates about what is life boil down to a question of what does it mean to scientifically study life if what we understand the sciences to be or to do is to sort of fully mechanically explain via deterministic laws how matter works, right? So, and that gave not just philosophers, but also some scientists pause, because it seemed to violate some basic intuition that life was more than just something that could be deterministically or mechanistically explained. And so the broadest sort of umbrella term for this resistance to that is what we would call vitalism. And there were heated debates about whether or not it was sort of anti-scientific to assert that life couldn't necessarily be explained by physics or by chemistry, and that maybe life needed its own set of principles that weren't as deterministic. And then with the discovery of the structure of DNA, those questions don't disappear, but they kind of get overshadowed by the excitement that comes with this, we now know this molecule that is part of every single living thing on Earth, and this metaphor of a kind of program that comes into being as the gene or the genome as the program for life. And so we'll look at how that model of the program reanimates a kind of different kind of model of life as machine, but as a much more complicated machine. And we'll go from there.
Wonderful. So now let's take that kind of storyline in parts and dig in a little bit deeper. So let's start kind of at the beginning of the snapshot that you just shared, before DNA and genetics. At that time, how did philosophers think about and grapple with the distinctiveness of life?
So I think, excuse me, there's I think the thing we'll focus on at least are philosophers that were interested in resisting what they saw as the reduction of life to the laws of physics and chemistry, which seemed overly linear, overly deterministic. And so they were looking for ways to think about life in a way that was scientific and not sort of irrational or religious, right? So back to this religious question, it was a matter of how can we be scientifically rigorous, philosophically careful, but hold out for some combination of maybe epistemological or sort of a question of knowledge, or perhaps even just a fundamental moral commitment to the idea that there's some possibility of autonomy or of consciousness or even purposefulness in how life behaves that we can't reduce to physics. And so what we'll do is we'll look at a few of what I think are the most eloquent and convincing explorations of those questions. One is by Georges Canguilhem, one is by Hans Jonas. There's probably a little bit more. And also the way that they try to show us that the idea that life is somehow strange because it doesn't it's not easily explained through physics or through chemistry or through mechanistic models is a very new and modern problem. And so they're trying to show us that prior to modern science, nobody thought life was weird, right? Life was just everywhere. And then it's the kind of success of the modern sciences that leads to this apparent conundrum of like, well, but then how could we have consciousness? How could we have freedom? And so part of what they do that I think is so compelling is show us that that's a very modern problem.
Well, and so speaking of that modern problem, can you maybe point to a few of the moments that were most significant from a scientific standpoint and how they forced us to grapple anew with the meaning of life? And then, maybe even bring us to today and some of the really interesting, in our prep call, we talked about some of the Jewish mystics that are like looking at both of these sides. But let's start with kind of what are some of the big moments in scientific discovery that kind of problematized, our philosophical understanding of life. And then, how does that bring us to kind of where we are today and some of these interesting people that are kind of combining, both a philosophical and a scientific lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to the ones I've mentioned about DNA and evolution, one that I think we might not read about directly, but if anybody's interested, I'd love to think about this more, is in embryology, in developmental biology and embryology, there was a kind of continuing mystery for scientists in the 20th century to try to explain how it is that, like, when you start from one cell, like a fertilized egg, how do the various cells know what to be? So like, how do these things spatially organize themselves? And it's actually incredibly difficult scientific problem that I think like there's huge progress that's been made in the present. It's no longer a total mystery, but it remains a really complicated question.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think that conundrum, so that's actually returning to that second part of what I'm interested in, is like what scientists don't know. The fact that that remained so challenging, even with these amazing microscopes and this amazing ability to look at cells as they divided and developed, created a kind of like lingering attachment to the idea that there might be some vital force or some life principle that was animating the organism as it developed. Even as somebody who would really believed in the progress of modern science would still say, yeah, but we can't explain this with our scientific tools. So perhaps there's an argument for vitalism of some kind. And to come to the much more contemporary moment, I think what we're seeing now is very interesting with the kind of complication of the genetic model with these new models of epigenetics and gene environment interaction and also gene editing. So epigenetics essentially being the study of how genes turn on and off, how they regulate. Why is it that DNA has actually big pieces of it they used to call junk DNA because scientists thought they didn't do anything because they didn't code for one protein. Now there's all this new research on how, in fact, the genome isn't just a simple script that gets read in order. And then, and that has been really complicating in really fascinating ways, our ability to think of the genome as a kind of script or program. And the last readings of the course will be from a French philosopher who, as I mentioned, also was very invested. He's actually still living, so I shouldn't say was, also is very invested in Jewish mysticism and those philosophical traditions. But what we're going to read is his scientific work. He's a biophysicist on some of these questions that complicate the linear idea of the genome.
Well, so this course is quite an undertaking because you're combining, multiple fields of knowledge. Can you talk a little bit about how you're going to approach teaching this? And also, do people that might be interested in learning more need a scientific background in order to participate fully in the class? So just talk through how you'll be able to, create a foundation that everyone, even a liberal arts, literature backgrounded person can fully participate.
Yeah, I know this class, it can sound a little bit like technical, but the texts are all, first of all, some of my absolute favorite philosophy texts, full stop. A lot of them are really beautifully written. So if you're a person has any sort of interest in reading beautifully written philosophy or political thought, I think they'll be just on that level. It'll be very enjoyable. There's absolutely no scientific background expected, let alone required. The very final text, if you were to look at the syllabus and look up all the readings, that last text by the biophysicist would look the most intimidating because I believe it even has a few diagrams, but the tools we're going to get from from the reading throughout the quarter are going to equip us to really extract together as a class the philosophical arguments that he is making, and he's really making a philosophical argument even though his training is in biophysics. So that one would be the most intimidating, but it's last, and we're going to go through it together. And I would say that essentially for me, philosophy is, I think seminars are the best format for philosophy, and I really try to take advantage of that format in the way that I teach. So I try, like the reading is not super long because it's pretty dense, and we're going to spend a lot of time together in class walking through the pieces that we as a class determined to be the most interesting and the most challenging, so that we can kind of together come to an understanding of what this text is asking us to think about, what it's challenging us on. So my approach is basically, I'm not a scientist. I mean, I took, undergraduate level science. So it's not that I have a science background, but I'm not a scientist. And I teach in philosophy and history departments. So my students almost never have science backgrounds.
Wonderful. Well, I want to open it up to questions from our audience, but I have one more as we await their questions. And for those out there, just chat in your questions and we're going to get to them right after this. I'm curious, in your view, why this matters. And I know it may seem so obvious, given that this is a huge part of your work, and given that, this is an existential question, why are we here? What makes us the thing? But, as you think about this whole debate and, how does this matter to our world, and how do shifting ways of understanding human life actually shape the way that we interact and the way that we kind of tell our story? I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about kind of the so what of all of this, if you looked over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a few pieces that are so what to me. I mean, one is the same feeling that I get from all really really rich philosophy, which is like there's something very enriching about engaging with it and understanding it, and how it just reshapes. For me, when I read a really significant piece of philosophy, it sort of stays with me in everything I do, right, from then on to some degree. But I think especially when it comes to philosophy that's engaging so directly and so committedly with the contemporary science of its time, I actually think it kind of calls on us to think about how we want to engage with the sciences today, as citizens, as just as ethical people, right? So there are all sorts of ways in which how we understand what is life might affect us. So I actually spent 3 years working in a bioethics department, and it's certainly the case that like how the legal system understands life ends up really affecting bioethics law, for example. How people think about what is autonomy, what is freedom, affects how we think about, the ethics and how we might want to regulate or not CRISPR and other kinds of genetic technologies. So these things can become really immediately politically relevant if that's something you care about. And if you just really like reading philosophy, I think this class has a lot to offer on that level too.
So I'm curious to peek into the future a little bit, because we're about to see, and University of Chicago is a part of this innovation, a new set of technologies that aim to imitate life in some ways. So, artificial intelligence and, the automation almost of human lives, the kind of genesis of robotics that could take jobs, which are not the same in any way as the philosophy, but they begin to question like, what is distinct? Because this person can contribute, they can be a productive member of society. They just happen to have a chip versus a DNA code inside of them. And so I'm curious kind of for your reactions to, how this study gives us potentially perspective on what's ahead in scientific evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big questions of the course and of any engagement with the kind of history and philosophy of biology is, what is the relationship between the kind of stuff that we are, right? This kind of like matter that's organized in a certain way that seems to have these properties of life, right? And in the case of humans, has language and consciousness, and perhaps other animals do too. What is the relationship between that kind of material instantiation and then our own moral and political commitments or ideas about how we want our lives to look on the level of, society? And so I think thinking about, like, does it matter that we define all life as having to contain DNA? Does that change how we might regulate or morally respond to AI or not? And is our primary ethical commitment to, humanoid beings with DNA inside them? Or is it, what if we put DNA, what if there was artificial life, right? Which is another even further off, but happening, right? Synthetic biology. So I think it just gives us more precision in talking about these things, because we have a lot of intuitions about, like, individually, we have a lot of intuitions about that seems scary and bad. And maybe that's right. Maybe it is scary and bad, but thinking about what is it about us that we want to defend as human or as living creatures, and what might be just a prejudice. I mean, so I think it's just helpful to have more language to think about that, and more history of how that question has been raised before.
Kate Adams asks in the chat, what is meant by the linear thinking of the genome? I think I heard you mention that this notion is challenged, but I'm not sure what is meant by that original statement of linear thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you asked me to clarify. So what I meant was that essentially when scientists like Watson and Crick most famously has discovered the molecular structure of DNA, and in that first decade or so, there was this idea, which is still partially true, that the genome is composed of genes. Each gene is a sort of script that codes for one enzyme, and enzymes are and proteins, and those are like what the body is made up of, right? And so it was sort of understood, and this is for interesting historical reasons too, about the sort of intellectual moment of the early Cold War period, and how significant linguistics actually were to the general intellectual climate at the time. But this was really taken as like this metaphor of DNA as a script or as a program. And even the fact that we have these like letters, right, which denote the various amino acids, nucleotides. And so it was understood essentially that if you had a string of DNA, it would be read in order by a cell, and the cell would take those directions and make those proteins, right? And so that's what I meant by linear. And when that gets challenged or complicated, it's because people start to realize, well, pieces of this actually don't get read, they get skipped. And actually, sometimes some pieces get read and others don't. And sometimes it gets read twice in a row. So it becomes this much more complicated relationship between that molecule that is kind of a string, right? So it's also because of the shape, I mean, it's two strings together, but it turns out that it doesn't operate as a string. And that's what I meant.
Richard Fisher thanks you for the stimulating and challenging presentation. Asks, when you speak of vitalism, do you reference the entire tradition back to the Greeks, or are there more dominant, perhaps scientifically informed variants of vitalism, or are these all conceptually similar as being in opposition to mechanistic or deterministic practices and principles of contemporary science?
Thank you. So that's a wonderful question, and it will be like very much alive in the readings we do. So we're only going to read 20th century, this class is a very 20th century class. So we're only reading 20th century thinkers who would never have embraced the self-label like vitalist in any uncomplicated way. So, but Jonas in particular, and to some degree also Canguilhem, which are two of the people that I'm kind of putting under this umbrella of vitalism, but that's an active debate, right? Deeply indebted and interested in an Aristotelian model for thinking about life. And one of the essays we read by Jonas is explicitly about Aristotle on the soul. So the answer to your question is like yes, yes, and yes. It's kind of all, but we're going to the degree that we engage with Aristotle, it'll just be through the lens of these 20th century thinkers who are very hesitant to think of themselves as vitalists, because that comes with, by the 20th century, that comes with this like irrationalist or anti-scientific connotation. So they don't actually embrace that label, but they are pushing back against this mechanistic, scientistic understanding of life. And they are interested in bringing Aristotle into that philosophical toolkit to do that.
A follow-up from Richard, unrelated to the first, is will you be able to bring CRISPR developments into the course? And I'm not sure if he is among the Graham learners, but there was a program that Graham had where we actually had people in residence at the Marine Biological Laboratory, and they were able to actually use CRISPR technology there and imagine and then build their own
Cool.
organisms with gene editing.
So, I mean, the question, so right now, the last week of the course is like in the texts are from like the 80s, 90s. So we don't directly engage with CRISPR. But actually, one of the things I meant to say in my like, what's the course teaching style going to be like, is that part of what I am interested in is if students kind of have connections to contemporary science they want to make, there's places I can sub in a little bit. The last week, for example, like I could, depending on who's in the class, if people want to read a contemporary article about CRISPR instead of one of the two essays, I'm actually completely open to that because that's part of the point of the class. But there's no CRISPR material on the syllabus.
We have a question from Sigmund. Are biological scientists who are working within their particular paradigm equipped to answer the what is not known question?
Sometimes. So, I mean, I don't want to, there's no way to answer that as a general rule, but I guess that, so I think that you have to look for places where the kind of what is not known comes out. So, for example, when I was at Penn, as I mentioned, I had spent a few years at Penn in the med school in the bioethics or the medical ethics department. And one of the things I was able to do was spend time with their kind of like epigenetics working group, or like their Institute for Epigenetics there, which is not one laboratory or one discipline. It's any faculty that have any interest in things related to gene regulation. And so I think that's one of the places where I saw this kind of unknown emerge, because you had people from neuroscience and people from genetics kind of having a clash of paradigms. And then it was there that the question of like, what we don't know became much more explicit. And really the thing they didn't know was, they know there's all these gene regulatory mechanisms that are really complicated. They operate in the brain, they operate in the body. And then what becomes clear is the mechanism of possible inheritance is what's unknown. People don't fully understand yet whether these mechanisms can be inherited. And that becomes clear as you see these different disciplines within biology interact with each other. So as like a contemporary look, as I look at contemporary science, that's one of the things I think is most interesting, is how fields interact. And I wouldn't say clash, but interact and then maybe have to struggle to understand each other. And that's where you start to see the interesting unknowns come out.
We have a question about a specific set of researchers. Do Bergson and Deleuze figure into this course philosophically? Particularly, do you draw attention to the notion of diagram and abstract machine?
So the very quick answer is no, they're not in this course. And that's not for any good, that's just because of the length of the course. I mean, Bergson is a bit earlier than the beginning of the course, but that's arbitrary, right? It could, I mean, he would be a great person to include in an expansion of the course. Deleuze, I haven't, I love the idea that somebody wants to read some Deleuze in a course, but he's pretty challenging. But if that's somebody who really likes Bergson and Deleuze should feel free to reach out to me, because that's all within my personal research interests and wheelhouse.
All right, well, so noted. And our learners are very ambitious. So I'm not surprised that they're choosing some challenging philosophers. David Thompson asks, will you discuss when human life is thought to begin? Relevant, he mentions, because of the abortion debate, as well as the question of should viruses be considered alive?
So interesting. So, well, I mean, right now, the question of the abortion question is not actually in this course at all, which is partly just because of the framing of the course is less about questions of, conception and origin, although there's all actually, I think Hannah Arendt is really interesting on this too. Not on abortion explicitly, but on the sort of natality. There's so many things we could bring in on that. And we're not reading like contemporary political controversies, but I do think this course can inform anybody who's interested in those questions, not because we read directly about when does human life begin, but because we just get some more tools for thinking about like what are even the stakes of saying that's life, that's not life, right? What's the difference between a cell and a fertilized egg? Like, why does that even carry so much ethical or moral or political weight? What was the second one? Oh, the virus. Again, nothing that I can think of explicitly talks about the question of whether viruses are alive, except that several of the texts will speak to that question because they'll think about limit cases. And I could recommend a few fun essays on sort of the limit cases of life, which for reasons of having only 8 weeks didn't make it into this version of the syllabus, but viruses are one case. And I think some of the Jonas speaks to that sort of like, do you have to fulfill all these criteria? Or now that we just have this genetic definition of life as things that have DNA, that challenge it, that sort of like, is that enough of a definition? Is that the best, most meaningful definition? And certainly those questions will be in the course.
Well, so let me follow up on this original question of, conception, beginning of life, with a set of questions in the chat related to end of life. Joseph asked, do we know what makes a body stop living? And then let me just read Nitsana's comment. When the brain stops, life can continue. When the heart stops, life stops. Will that be discussed? And so I guess I'll pair those for you to respond to this question of how do we better understand the end of life?
I guess what I would say is this is all making me think that what I want to teach next year is a bioethics class, because these are all things that I personally have done research on, have worked on, have talked about a lot in the context of like medical ethics and the sort of legal history of how we decide when the end of life is defined. So I guess like these are all things that I can say I would love to talk about more. This is making me think there might be interest in my teaching a kind of intellectual history of bioethics class in the future, but I don't want to sell you on my future course. Like also, if you're interested in those things, I think you'll find things of interest in this course. But it is more like focused on the kind of philosophical attempts at philosophical precision about defining life as against non-life as against life death, right? And that's also because it's engaged with biology at the level of cells and molecules. And then, of course, you can zoom out and look at the question of human life more specifically when you're just talking about human life. Then all of a sudden, life, death, conception, questions of abortion become even more central. So the bioethics questions are sort of like another zoom in from this course.
Well, so we have one more question on maybe what's covered, but maybe just kind of how it applies, because I know this is outside of probably the direct focus of the course. And that is, how are you thinking about life in other places? Meaning are there life forms on other planets? Is there any engagement with that as we think about what makes life distinct?
Yeah, so this, I think, limit cases of not necessarily life discovered on other planets, but even life in like the absolute deepest parts of the ocean, or life that can survive being hurled into space because of like tardigrades and like various like forms of life that survive the extreme heat in the ocean. I think this extreme pressure at the bottom of the ocean, et cetera. I think those are all great contemporary examples of like pushing us past maybe easier, or not past, pushing us past maybe some of the more observational, or even in some cases, some of the more Aristotelian definitions of life based on certain like properties that they exhibit, right? Because all of a sudden there's always a limit case, whether that's a virus or whether that's like a deep sea microorganism. And so those can be really fun to think with once you've think you have the answer, right? Even if you think DNA is the answer, then there's the virus, right? If you think it's a certain kind of reproductive cycle, then you have these organisms that have these incredibly long hibernation periods that are dependent on temperature, et cetera. So that's something that we can definitely will come up in the course.
A final question from Ira Pilchin: does life need to be carbon-based?
You tell me. I mean, that's like, I think that would be exactly the kind of question I think we'd want to think about, like, and it goes back to the question of automation and AI, right? Like, is there do we want to draw a kind of chemical or molecular line around saying this is what counts as life, this isn't? If we make a machine that behaves in every way like life, is it life? If we synthesize life, is that the same as life that emerges from other life, right? What if it was grown in a lab? Well, it doesn't follow the principle of reproduction. Like, if we care about how reproduction is part of what defines life, being created from nothing in a lab would also violate some of those principles. So I think what really, by the way, actually the essay that we definitely will read the last week, even if we throw in some more contemporary stuff too, is this biophysicist who is engaged with the Jewish mystical tradition as well, is an essay called "Does Life Exist?" Because essentially what he's asking is, now that we have this incredibly sophisticated molecular kind of understanding of what the organism is it even meaningful to distinguish between life and non-life anymore? So part of what the course does is kind of circle all the way back to the very beginning, when, as Jonas, one of the early philosophers we read, tells us, prior to the modern sciences, it wasn't a problem because the sciences weren't sort of threatening to explain away life. And then in the very late 20th century, we have the reemergence of that in a new way, which is to say, maybe this distinction between life and non-life doesn't make any sense once we understand the world through these models of organization of molecular scale matter.
Well, we are out of time, Isabel, which is a shame because this has been an amazing conversation, and you've given new life to this topic, pardon the pun, and we are immensely grateful. I mean, we feel so fortunate for this partnership with IFK to be bringing new forms of knowledge to our learners. And so thank you for teaching at Graham, and thank you for sharing your upcoming course today. And the chat is filled with others thanking you as well.
Thank you so much for having me and for being here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all, and have great afternoons. And yeah, looking forward to hearing the lively discussions in your class this winter.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to it. Thank you.